Who's this Josh guy? Overbearing.
It's just
like when you hear his voice, you just know it's him.
Yeah, you kind of think
you also just don't like it immediately. Something about his face.
The hair on the back of your neck.
You
something about your face.
There's a
I just want to punch it.
Reaction, right? Something about the face.
Anything I can do to change it? Nope, just your face.
Where is that from?
Step Brothers.
Oh yeah,
I just want to punch it. They're great.
I found it to be a hard read. Desiring God by John Piper, right? Is it John Piper?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I thought it was hard to listen to. I think if I had read it, it would be a little easier.
Yeah.
And this sounds bad, but it was because of all of his biblical references.
Made to follow along.
Made so hard to it interrupted the flow so much when you was reading it like verbatim as it's written.
Correct.
Because he would start into like a complex thought. He's like, one of our things is we should want to desire God. See Matthew 16:22 verses 19 and 20.
Right.
John 3:11. Well, we should also want to find joy in other things. See Luke chapter 2. And it was just like, oh my gosh, stop interrupting yourself. It was very, very difficult to listen to. If you're reading it, it would be like in either italics or, something to...
Or like footnoted maybe?
Or possibly, but you could just like buzz through that or like your eye could skip it. But the thought that like when you had to actually interrupt your thought, it was very difficult for me to listen to it and then keep focused on the complex thought, like the thought process that he was trying to get to. The points that he was trying to make.
Yeah. Plus, you're not super smart, so that's hard.
Just in general. So
just with any book,
right, yeah.
Plus the words to Heloid.
Okay, so my third daughter is starting to read, and I'm teaching her today. We were going over some reading, and there was just the letter A, right? A or
Yeah.
And I couldn't see the book and she was struggling on it. She was reading well and then she gets to that and she's like, what is this word, Dad? I was like, oh yeah. It's just the letter A, honey. You know this one. She's reading like
sound it out.
The jet flies through. That's it. That's it. You got it. That's it.
That's pretty good. This one probably would have been easier to follow if you were reading it, but honestly, like I have such a hard time with that the older I get.
Like sitting and reading, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Like I end up getting very drowsy.
I know what you mean.
When I do that,
drowsy. What an old person's word.
While I'm sitting on my Davenport, I get very drowsy.
Yeah, that was impressive.
Yeah. On the boulevard. Obviously it was kind of like that Heaven book, that Elkhorn book, where it was like every paragraph had like 5 biblical references, which is good, but sometimes I think there's it's almost too heavily relied on with some Christian authors.
Agreed.
Because there's like an old sort of sermon joke that like anybody can write a sermon if they just keyword search a specific word. Like I'm going to write about faith today. So they do a keyword search in the Bible about faith.
Yeah.
And 50 verses comes up and then you just logically draw like, here's the things about faith that I have. Like it's very easy.
What's the thing in the back of the Bible called?
So the Limp Bizkit reference.
What's the thing in the back of the Bible called?
Yeah. Concordance?
Concordance, yeah, where you could do the same thing without the Google keyword search.
Okay,
It was like the old original Google.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Just look it up. Or
the Hebrew.
Like an index. Sometimes they call it index too.
What's Google in Hebrew?
I think it's just Google because it's like proper out.
We'll let that.
Yeah. Or Google.
Google sounds good.
Yeah. Something
Google.
Like that. Michael Bublé. Michael Bublé. So yeah, that I think sometimes you can see that when you see people preaching, it's like the original thought idea wasn't there at all, and they're just sort of stepping from one scripture to the next,
compiling all the related verses.
Yes,
yeah,
and there doesn't seem to be a larger point that they're trying to make.
I thought he did. I thought he had a larger point that was maybe pretty obvious, like theme throughout the book.
Sure.
As far as like finding joy in your faith walk.
Yeah, Hinduism. right? He's a Christian
Hedonism.
Hindu.
No,
Hedonism.
Heed, take heed of.
He headed.
Heeded.
Headed.
He headed.
Beheaded. His capo was detated.
That's a deep Office reference. That's like three different Office references.
Yeah, that was like the inception of Office references. It was like
No, but I thought he had the overall theme, but some of his supporting like arguments were a little difficult to follow.
Yeah. So one of the main quotes he uses in the book is, "The chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever."
Basically, he quotes the Bible on C.S. Lewis
He
for
does,
50% of his writing.
and Jonathan Edwards,
Yes.
which I have not read almost
Me neither.
anything on Jonathan Edwards.
Me
I know the big sermon that he referenced. The
Sermon on the Mount.
that wasn't Jonathan Edwards.
That was John the
that was
Baptist.
Jesus.
It's way off.
I think that was Jesus. John the Baptist. This
It's
guy.
a joke.
Sure you were.
Might have been Edwards.
So the sinner's in the hands of an angry God. I'm sure you guys have read that one before.
No.
That's a very famous sermon. We read that in public schools.
The idea of Christian hedonism in general is appealing to me. I would say that
Me too.
I probably align quite a bit with that. So so even as a kid, like for anybody that knows the Enneagram, I'm a 7 on the Enneagram. So basically I
Right.
just like joy and like things
Yeah.
to a fault. And so
Like obsession.
yeah, like I
Just like to try new things constantly.
like to try to do things constantly, and I like to always do something, and sitting still and doing nothing is
Difficult.
very difficult and the opposite of what I want to do.
Gotcha.
And I see that now in my daughter. I think she's a 7 too. Like my oldest, she just wants to constantly do something. And it doesn't even matter what it is. If you're doing something, it's something new and it's therefore exciting. Therefore, we have fun. So all that to say,
yeah.
a lot of times I really struggled in the church because it felt very anti-joy.
I agree with that.
Agreed.
Like it's you have to follow these things.
Felt more like a duty to me growing up.
Yeah, that for sure. And there was a lack of freedom to enjoy what God has given you. It was like obviously turning from sin is important, but I hated when I would walk away from church a lot of the times and just feeling terrible about myself. And I know I'm not alone in that because I know a lot of people have turned simply for that reason. And there's value in that, but I always felt like the go-to in a sermon is, hey, what are you doing wrong? Let's point that out and show.
Yeah, or what can you do better?
Yeah. And we gotta get on top of that, and you have to be better than that.
Yeah.
And so
guilt-based.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so that would often turn me off from wanting to go. Not that it's stopped me per se, but I just always felt like this idea of, man, if God created us and created this world, created everything in it, He also created joy, He created happiness, and there's just this like dark cloud of that God is this anti-joy monster who wants you just to obey what He says. And that just always seemed antithetical to how I was, like my actual nature. And I was struggling with that. So this to me, the book resonated for me in that regard of, no, God made you to enjoy and to take pleasure and delight in His goodness. It actually like requires it of you to.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
I thought it was I always had kind of almost like the opposite growing up, where I always thought like I agree with you that, okay, first happiness and joy, I always think of two pretty different things,
separate things,
right?
yeah.
Like happiness is kind of a fleeting emotion, right? Oh, I got a new car, I'm so happy. And then like a month later, you're like, oh, I didn't realize I had to pay this payment it's not true, like happiness, right?
Not long lasting.
Yeah, and it's not like this internal indwelling joy, right? Where if you meet somebody who's like confident in their faith and they know God and they're just sometimes they just have like a joy about them that's like almost indescribable.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, their day's going terrible and they haven't got a new car in 5 years, but they're just like,
so dang
they're
happy.
just, it's not even happy like they're like, oh, I'm so happy. They're just like so content with
I
life.
agree with you, but I'm not sure the majority of people are able to differentiate between that. Because I
agree.
I think as a kid, I would associated the same two things.
The same two things. I agree.
Synonyms,
and not
basically.
until like I was an adult could
I think a lot of
bad.
I think a lot of adults still think of it as the same. And I think they search for that happy feeling, and they don't always get it at church. So they do, they do drugs, or they, or drink a lot, or they go to parties or the club or whatever, and that gives out that happy feeling. And yet they still feel empty at the end of the day.
Are you talking about like people chasing basically a dopamine effect, or
that's kind of what I'm thinking?
Yeah.
Yep. When I think of happiness, that's more what I think. Like that fleeting emotion, that chemical release in your body, where you're just like, wow, that was awesome, but it doesn't really last. You make all this money, you get a big bonus, and you're like, oh, just a few days later, a few hours later, you're like, oh, this didn't actually make me happy.
Right.
But when you think about something like having a wife who loves you, and like, children who want to be around you, and you're like so proud of what they're doing, and you see how they are.
Yeah.
You're like, that brings you like a true indwelling joy. And I feel like a lot of that is rooted. For me, I always felt very like, maybe more joyous than I did happy. Like when I would go to church and stuff, I never really used to feel like happy about it. It was always more of like a duty.
Right.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I felt like I had this peace, this calm, this joy.
Right.
In the fact that like I knew God, I knew my destiny in the afterlife, and I had like a real peace about that, and that gave me a different joyous outlook on life. Absolutely. Although church itself and hanging out with kids from church stuff rarely made me feel happy.
Sure.
So as a kid, I wanted to be happy, right? And I didn't really appreciate the fact that my parents were trying to really give me more of a foundation,
right,
for really more of a joyous life, where there's true joy, like in Christ,
right,
for me. And I think, but there's different. Not everybody realizes that those two are different.
Yeah,
and not everyone has the same experience.
I don't know if you guys ever went to, I think Kyle, you did, and I'm not sure if Joey, you might have also been to Christian camp when you were a kid.
Yep. Yeah.
And especially like middle school, high school, that's where like I started taking my faith very seriously, was in, it was elementary school, but then when we got to middle school and high school, it was like a week long of everybody's nice to each other. Like there's so much devotional time. There's a ton of praise and worship time. Like everybody's getting into it. Everybody is honestly really trying hard. Much more so than like you would have at maybe a normal church service. You come back to your normal church service and you're like, oh, these people aren't really trying that hard. It seems like, but you have that joy, and it's like, I've heard pastors talk about it as a mountaintop experience. So like you're up at the mountaintop, but inevitably you're going to be coming down again. So, is that league really just full of those chemical reactions, and am I really just chasing that feeling? Or am I doing what Piper is asking us to do in this book here, is really chase after God, specifically enjoying him and separating that from the blessings of him? I think that was a big part of this book, is separating who God is and his character and just enjoying him for who he is, separate from, oh, he's blessed me with an amazing family. He's blessed me with a job. He's blessed me with fellowship with friends. Like all those things are great, but I think Piper has a higher calling in mind when he talks about enjoying God forever, different than enjoying the blessings of him forever, if that makes sense.
I think,
it makes sense.
That's, I would go to camp for a week every summer, and that was one of the best weeks every year for me. And I would walk away from it with that same feeling of like, oh, this feels more like Christianity to me.
Exactly.
This feels more like what the Christian faith should be, instead of going to church for an hour, walking away feeling guilty or feeling bad about myself.
Right.
And then that's it.
Yep. And another week passes, and
then you come back and do it again. So I think when I originally asked you guys to go to camp, I think I was longing for that feeling again as an adult, because there's always been this disconnect to me, where a lot of times like kids' church is so fun, right? You have vacation Bible camp, and then you go to church camp, and then your services are fun half the time, and then you go on a retreat and you get to play sports and play all these games, and you learn about God. And that's like when you become an adult, it's, hey, you got to show up for an hour service on the Sunday morning, and there's not a lot of fun to be had. It's time to get serious. And it's like,
right.
Is it though? Is that right?
Can we still have fun?
Yeah. So like that searching for me was the idea of the camp was what I was always longing for. Like, and that's why it's like one of the best weekends.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Every year that we go.
I always feel like those Christian church camps, we have been to those, had similar experiences, right?
Yes.
Like I said, everyone's on their like best behavior.
It's true.
And also
everybody's trying to be a
not only that, but the Holy Spirit is present in those moments.
I would
like
agree.
Big time, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like it's almost like a little glimpse of what God had in mind for a greater church, right? Or for like, hey, this is like a quick preview of what heaven could be like, but every day. Right. And I find it interesting that we basically all had those experiences as kids.
I know.
And we agree. I also went to football camp for a week.
Me too.
I also went to basketball camp for a week or whatever. And that was fun, but it's not the same.
For sure.
It's not the same. And there's happy moments and there's fun moments and stuff, but it's not the same as going to like a Christian camp where you're worshiping with your friends. So that helped. Yeah, that was very hard.
You always think
that's why I would go to the Christian camp so I could really dominate the homeschool kids. hey, sorry, Joey. Shout out to Joey.
But no, I think, like you said, like I think we all had those experiences, and I spent 7 summers up at camp working up there and stuff like that.
Right.
Was it that long?
It was
7.
Yeah. If you actually take it out and like how long I spent up at camp, it's over 3 years of my life. I mean,
that's
but you were also a camper too, though, right? Before you did staff.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. I was. But like even when you, that's one thing we always talk about when we were up there is like when you're up at camp, you're constantly serving with people who have the same mission, who have the same goal. We're all up there like-minded. Everybody's focusing on the mission of spreading the gospel. And it's almost like this bubble.
Yeah,
like
for sure.
You're there by yourself, basically. Like you were saying, you feel the presence of the Holy Spirit. You feel that you are 100% surrounded. You're 100% in the right place. And then you leave and you're no longer a part of that bubble at the end of the summer.
Right.
And not only that, but everybody that you're surrounded with when you get back, not a single one of those people had the same experience that you had during the summer. And it's so easy for them to just like basically just piece you apart,
drag you down into the mud.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like you had a great summer, huh? And you try telling them like, the heck are you talking about? Like especially if you went like back to school or something like that, they're like, you start telling them like, I'm like, yeah, I got to share the gospel. Like, it's the gospel. What are you talking about?
Exactly.
And stuff like that. And it's so difficult to stay in that mountaintop mindset.
Exactly.
When the first thing you see is someone trying to drag you down just because they didn't experience the same thing that you did, and get them to feel that. You know what I mean?
Do you guys think that the mountaintop is a bad thing? I always get kind of frustrated there, where it's like, oh yeah, you're in a mountaintop, but you'll come crashing back down. Don't worry, that's not the real world. And it's like, yeah, okay, but at the same time, I think there's a ton of value in the recharge factor. Like, why do you go on vacation? You need to recharge because you can't work for 25 years straight without missing a day. It's kind of the point, is to get away, quote unquote, recharge your batteries. And that's kind of your mountaintop in a non-Christian way.
Absolutely.
Right. So
I think it's also like a good leader trying to prepare you for reality, because they know and they've experienced the fact that, hey, this bubble does end at the end of the week or at the end of the summer.
Yep.
And you are going to be back in the real world. And like what you have at camp, what you experience at camp, it isn't anything magical about that property or about it's people, right? And it's people who get like-minded, who are like-minded and who bring others into that.
Right.
And what they're trying to say is like, it's not like this everywhere. Right. Be prepared, but also be prepared, like to go on offense a little bit. Like, you can create the same environment at your school, or at your church or at your youth group, right? Yeah. Like, not to convict you, not to make you feel guilty that you haven't, but just to say, hey, this isn't going to last forever. And when those hard times come, you would be wise to be prepared mentally, because it could be very depressing, like you said, if you get back to the quote unquote real world and it's nowhere near the mountaintop that you've been enjoying for a week or for a month at camp.
Yeah, for sure. For me specifically, I remember coming back from camp every year and then having so much more temptation, like the day I came back from camp, to give into whatever sins I was struggling with, whether it was anger or lust or, even cursing or things like that.
That's interesting.
Like, as soon as I got back, it was like, I don't know, the enemy was ready to pounce, I think. And sort of like, if you have an experience, even like maybe not at camp, but even somewhere else where you're having an experience, like for us together at a men's retreat or us together at a men's night or something, and we're feeling close to God, then there is almost a vulnerability to us that it could be easy to snatch it away. I don't know if that makes sense. It could be easy for the enemy to come in and kind of grab you. Or one little thing goes wrong and it sort of tumbles you. That's how I know I get in the struggle of like that sort of guilty cycle, is like, well, the thing I did wrong negated all the good things I did that previous week.
Yeah. That's just the enemy.
Absolutely it is. Yeah. And it is the preparation that you need, like you were saying, Will,
Preparation.
Yes. Sometimes you need that too. If it
Depends on the camp food.
Yeah. Different orifices are red and swollen. Yeah. So I think to your point, Kyle, just about the mountaintop experience and enjoying God, I think we really don't focus on that in church. I think we try to with maybe like the worship session that we have.
Sure.
And he talked about it in the book. He called it the feast of a Christian hedonist, that when you're worshiping God, like the singing part of it or other ways that you worship God. I don't know. Do we really think of that as like a feast experience? Like, are we
I was just going to comment on worship, how we talked about like there's two different things. Like you have this really joyous experience like at summer camp or it's at church sometimes. I think at Easter Sunday at Hopeville,
like a great example.
Like that was pure joy. And I really feel like the worship can really set the tone between like a guilt-based message and a joyous message.
Absolutely.
Like Easter Sunday, it's just like boom, bright lights, super loud music, upbeat, 25 people on the stage, choir, everybody's singing, smiling, clapping, and you're just like, man, this just feels like you get that dopamine dump, and you're like, man, this is it. This is like, man, this is summer camp for adults, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then there's other times where you are led into worship that is maybe much more like sorrowful or reflective and slow, and kind of almost sets the tone for like, hey, what have you been doing wrong in your life? And I think there's a time for both of those messages.
Yeah.
But I do think it's, we don't always get the joy one maybe as much as I would like to. Do you remember our old worship leader used to always rip the banjo like once a month?
Yeah. Yeah, I do actually.
Because it was just on those days, you could just tell everyone was laughing, and he's like, yeah, I can't believe we're playing the banjo in church. And there was just like this palpable like excitement around it, right?
Kind of thing, yeah.
And I always thought that was really set the mood for like a good worship, not like worship experience, but like receiving a message with a joyous heart.
Yeah. Well, I think that's so much of the non-denominational movement is rooted in that, like
the fun aspect or
the worship aspect, the worship music. Like at our church, we have so many former Catholics and Lutherans and Baptists. And, what I've heard so many times is that the biggest difference is the worship music.
Sure. Right.
Like my grandma's a Catholic and she'll come for like Christmas or something like that. And she just loves the worship music instead of pulling out the hymn book and, listening to the Catholic priest sing the same hymns over and over. And there's a lack of engagement, I think, in that respect. Now, not for everybody, right? Some people enjoy that repetition.
Sure.
But I think in general, we've seen that. I think you can look over the last 25, 30 years in Christianity and point to that as one of the major catalysts for non-denominational.
Sure.
And even like, a lot of faiths now have the what do they call it? Like the new worship or the hymnal, however they want to phrase it, right? So they have two different services. In two different bands.
Traditional
So
and modern or something like that. Yeah.
Modern, where it's like, which one do you want to go to? Or what if you're like modern and you're like, oh, we missed the modern one. Now we got to go. We got to go traditional or vice versa.
Yeah. That
Right?
would
We gotta
be,
get stuff.
That would be
It's
rough.
different. That's interesting.
it's almost intentionally splitting the church.
It is.
Yeah.
But
So
I don't know.
usually same sermon with different songs.
Different work.
They do that at my brother's church. They have like the one that's early, like in the morning is like 9, and they do all hymns.
Geared toward.
Oh, that's
older
interesting.
Yeah,
folks.
and it's like an organ or a keyboard,
Yeah, right.
and that's it. You know what I mean, kinds of thing.
Yeah.
And then they do
12
the,
o'clock, they rock out.
Yeah, they have like
Red Bulls in the lobby, kids.
they do the guitars and all the things. You know, as exciting as church can get, I guess. I think there's a
Red Bulls in
sense
the lob. That's community. Community.
Yeah,
Red Bull.
Communions of Red Bull.
that would be pretty good. I think there's
Do this and remember it's me. Do the do.
do this. Mountain do this.
But it's code red. You know?
nice.
Yeah, so
Nice.
it's like
Yeah.
That makes
it
sense.
looks like
Actually,
blood, and it's
we could
bubbly like blood.
track from the moral list. I actually saw somebody on Instagram that just found a way to make wine out of Mountain Dew. So you can just make
That's weird.
No way, for real.
Yeah. I don't think it was.
They can ferment it.
Yeah, you like ferment it or you turn it into a mead.
Oh man.
Yeah. So you can reach out if that's what you want for your next communion.
Side note.
Yeah, I know. Just made me think of it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Ferment them up.
I think there's a sense of like if church is fun, then you're not doing it right.
Yeah, I agree with
Totally.
Or like that, yeah, you know, but if you don't take your faith seriously and are very somber, then like you're not a very disciplined person, kind of
Right.
thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Like you must just be like
And
an
discipline
Easter- yeah.
equals better Christian.
Exactly.
Right. Like.
Yep.
Which is like the exact opposite of what this book says. Like his
Yeah.
Exactly.
his
Yeah.
entire thing is
Yeah.
like he's like, hey, I want to find happiness in God, and I think it's okay for me to look for happiness in God.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You know.
Yep.
And so like that's why I appreciate about the book is like I feel like I think what is is a cataclysm? It's a Heidelberg cataclysm or whatever. Am I saying that right? That's that thing where he says that the chief end of man is to
Oh yeah.
The Westminster Shorter Catechism
that's what I'm looking for. So what does it say? Do you have a
says the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever.
yeah? And he changes it
Mm-hmm.
to be the chief end of man is to glorify God by enjoying Him forever.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Which is like, yeah, basically he's saying, you know, like, I want to glorify God by finding my enjoyment and my happiness in this life in Him or through God.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there's always such a negative. It's not even negative. It's just like a removal of, okay, so if you want to really take your faith seriously, you need to not drink, don't stay out late,
Mhm.
don't do all these things that are like the world says is fun. So you're like, oh, so you kind of just have this like almost like an obligation, like, well, I really want to be a serious Christian, but I don't always want to be serious. Like I
Right.
want to just be goofy and like enjoy Christ and make jokes and like
Yeah.
Yeah.
and have people around who are like we're laughing, smiling, doing the summer camp thing, but in real life all
Yeah.
day long. And that's really hard to find though. I mean,
It is.
that is like a rarity. And it's weird is because I find it really ironic because so many people desire that
Mhm.
and don't know how to articulate that
Sure.
and actually like execute it in real life. So they just kind of go through the motions. Like you said, they go to church. They don't want to be someone like laughing and joking during communion. So they're just everybody somber and serious, and then everyone leaves, and you kind of miss out on like all the fun
We
part.
can have fun.
Yeah.
Right.
I know a lot of people that are
It
that
almost
way,
goes
right?
back to
Yeah.
like the Gentiles versus the Jews, like in like the start of the start of like the church and
Mhm.
beginning of Acts, where it's like basically saying like the Jews are completely like they're following the old traditions, they're following the old law, where it's all about discipline, it's all about following every single
Right.
regulation and stuff like that. And when Paul steps in, he's like, "No, we found Jesus. We want to be happy with Jesus. Like
Right.
he came here to essentially like free you from those requirements so you
Right.
can find Him." and find your enjoyment in life in Him.
So that reminds me of the show The Chosen. I know I've repped this a few times. Great show if anyone's listening.
Great show.
We'd love for them to sponsor us if
Yeah.
they could.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're actually looking for sponsors, so they can make season 5. Yeah.
Mutual agreement. They plug us, we plug them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they do a really good job in that of portraying like the human side of Jesus, and they show him laughing and joking, and some of like his actual red letter quotes that we read in a real serious tone. They say, no, here's exactly what he said, but it's not a serious tone. He said it in a joking tone, tongue in cheek. He was teasing the disciples in this, and you're like, oh man, it's a different take, and we don't know exactly how he said it, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But it really portrays him in a very very human way, and you're like, man, I would want to just hang around this guy, and like, it wouldn't all be all seriousness and crucifixion and pain, like as we sometimes is portrayed. It was like, man, this guy was hilarious. Like he was fun and funny, and he would
turn the other cheek.
He would poke jabs at you.
He turns his butt cheek. Is that what?
That's exactly what.
Down. It's like,
I think that was season 5. I think that was season 5.
That was an outtake.
Yeah. That was the deluxe edition.
Super Chosen.
I actually had to pay for that one.
Right.
Yeah, deleted scenes.
So, but with the guilt base, when like when I was like in college, that's what turned me on to like Rob Bell's preaching.
Right.
Because I felt like for the first time that I heard a pastor focus more on the positives of God and of faith in Christianity.
And making up his own theology.
Well, eventually it went that way, right? Like, but originally he was very rooted and brought so much of the Hebrew and everything. That's the first time I ever
he was
heard that
very evangelical
incorporated
too, but like the new school evangelical. Where John Piper, I think, to me, is the old school evangelical.
Sure, but like but it was like I didn't walk away from his sermons feeling terrible about myself. It was like, oh yeah, like people. God already has this all mapped out. I'm already saved. Let's enjoy life. And now you can go down his theology now, where it's turned into
more
an
universal,
entire separate conversation, right?
Sure,
but it was like and I saw that in the people that were there in church with him, and it was like, whoa, this is just a different experience, and people could feel it, and that's why he blew up in a hurry,
right?
And that's part of where so many pastors had such an issue with him at the time, was like, your congregants went out and had a beer and stuff like that, like are you even a Christian? And it's like, come on, like, get over yourself a little bit. Times I always feel like that.
Yeah.
Get off your high horse.
Joey makes an interesting point. Like, it's almost like the Christian faith is rooted in a lot of ways in the Old Testament ideal of self-control and discipline and rule following. And it's like, that is probably much more synonymous with being a Christian than it probably should be or has to be. Yep.
Do you think that's like an era, what's the word for, like the age? Generational, thank you. Like, because when we were growing up, the generation above us, they're going to be 40, 50 years old. They're far more like work at GM and a little bit more rule-based, as opposed to, I feel like our generation is far less rule-based.
I think every generation says that.
Yeah, I wondered about that, because like the 60s were like the hippie movement too. You know what I mean? So,
but that was also like a section that was anti what everybody else was, right?
Yeah,
and that's why it became so popular, I think, because that's the same reason.
But I think in general, every generation gets less conservative.
Sure, like flies from authority.
And I don't mean politically conservative. I just mean
like traditionalist.
Yes.
Yeah. They don't value the old ways as much as they did.
Right.
Which is interesting, because the Bible really does talk, like Jeremiah specifically talks about valuing the old ways and stick to the ancient paths and that kind of thing. And but I think we sometimes have the idea that if that's not like fun or romantic, or that's not adventurous for me to just do what I did before. But maybe God is trying to, I think part of this book for me was trying to instill joy and happiness in like reading your scriptures together, or instill that happiness in singing praise and worship, or instill that happiness in listening and having a conversation. So like, for example, like these podcast discussions, and of course our men's group discussions before that, have always been fun to me, because it's like I get to finally be, like a little bit more free with what I say.
Yeah.
And say the kinds of things that I'm thinking about like all the time, especially with my own faith. And it's also in a safe place too. So I think that was part of the thing for me, was to really like, how do I enjoy what I have? Like, you've heard that old epithet, or that old proverb about it's not having what you want, it's wanting what you have. So really good. I think that was in
brother.
Yeah.
A coloring book.
That was at a yeah, that was at a yogurt
Barnes and
can, I
Noble.
think.
That's really good, Jim. I think I saw that on an episode of Sesame Street.
Yeah. But seriously though, that is true.
100%.
If you already have, like how I was saying, like, look, we're already saved, we're already enjoying God, like why aren't we just enjoying it?
Yeah.
As opposed to like thinking, well, I'm missing out on what the world's doing. Looks like they're having fun, and I'm going to church and I'm not.
I think
It's kind of like The Office, the Benihana Christmas. Is that Benihana where Angela has her own party and Pam and Karen have their own party, the separate party?
Yes, it is.
Yes,
And it was like,
yeah,
Angela's like, oh, you have to be here. This is the right one.
the Nutcracker Christmas.
Right, yeah.
Walk in, everyone's sitting there completely dead silent.
Exactly, yeah.
Can't have more than
And it's
one
like,
brownie.
sometimes that feels like Christianity to me, where it's like, this is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to drink this. You're supposed to eat this. This is therefore fun within that. So this is what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
And I feel like
so enjoy it. Sit down and
there's such
enjoy
a
it.
danger to that too, because like I feel like even when I was growing up, like there were so many times where like I was a good Christian kid and stuff like that, and I did not always feel a good Christian kid. Because why? Because I struggled to actually do any devotions. I struggled to pay attention during sermons and all this stuff. And even though, like, yes, I knew all the stuff in my head and stuff like that, I would feel guilt because I didn't do any devotions that day or something.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's so wrong. Like it points into the opposite way, where like what John Piper's saying, like you should be finding enjoyment in this. Like you should be finding happiness in God, not doing this out of requirement. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Right.
And I think that even goes, I think he talks about it in the marriage chapter.
Yes, he does.
Where he's talking and he's like, if your marriage, if you told your wife that, like, yes, I love you, but the only reason you're saying that is out of duty or obligation. Like that's not going to be, there's no joy in that.
Right.
And that's such an insulting thing to do.
Yeah.
Like you should love your wife because of who she is, but because of what she brings to your life, because of the enjoyment you find in her, and the life that you built together.
Get in the car, it's date night. Yeah, exactly. That's Josh whenever he has to do anything romantic at all.
But like, and that's what.
Here's flowers, I guess.
Right. It's such a big to do. Like, just let's get this over with.
But
did you read this book?
You made a comment a second ago about how it's often looked at like what you're missing out on.
Yes.
In the rest of the world, like the secular world.
Fun that you could be having.
Yeah. And I think that the biggest thing, at least for me, like in my personal life, is my walk of faith has always been lonely up until the last few years.
Yeah.
And I would say this group of guys here the last couple of years has really like scratched that itch for me to have friends and laugh and to goof around and not be sitting around getting drunk saying the F word every other word, but actually enjoying each other, making jokes about like some of the characters in the Bible and having like a little bit more intellectual discussion. It has been so fulfilling for me and so enjoyable. And it's been something that the first 30 years of my life, frankly, I didn't have any of that. Yeah. And so I didn't want to be bored on a Saturday night. It wasn't like I really wanted to go out, let's go get blasted. Like, yeah, there's some days where you feel like that, right?
Sure.
And I did that way too often in my 20s. But I think a lot of that was because I didn't know anybody, or I hadn't invested the time to get to know anybody.
Yeah.
And the Christians that I did know, I didn't feel like I had a lot in common with. And when I was with them, I didn't feel like I was having that much fun. It was sort of like, and these guys are different. They want to keep talking about like Game of Thrones and all this other like Yu-Gi-Oh cards, and they want to play Pokemon. I'm like, oh, I don't want to do any of that. Josh wants to read Marvel comedies or Marvel comics. Yeah, not even. I don't even know what they're called, dude. It's all a little. No,
basically the Stormies and the Joshes of the world.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that, but I didn't have that interest. Like I had nothing in common with a lot of the people that I met to this point, and I just didn't find much joy in it.
Yeah, it's almost like the Flanders effect on Simpsons.
It really is.
You know, like you see that, and that's that's the typical Christian family or whatnot.
Yeah,
and they just like all the things they do from the outsider's point of view are not fun at all.
And super corny.
Exactly.
And,
like so lame.
So
they all enjoy it for some reason.
My brother's one friend used to always call us the Flanders family.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Which is kind of ironic because we weren't really like that.
Exactly.
But in a lot of ways we were exactly like that too.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's yeah, we watched that a lot when I was growing up, and it's funny because Simpsons has they poke fun at Christianity quite a bit, especially church.
They poke fun at everything, which I kind of like.
Yeah, no, I like it too because there's lots of it that is true about the way that we exactly this type of thing. Like there's a scene I think where everybody's sort of itching to let go or itching to leave this church service, and he keeps like saying more verses. Like everybody's like, oh, he's gonna stop, and then he says something like amen, and they're like, okay, you said amen. They all run out. Like it's just funny because
it's like real life.
Yeah, I think we've all thought that in church before. You know, like at one time I saw my dad nodding off, in church, and I was just like, oh man, if I can't even keep it together, how am I going to keep
You want to know a funny story? On Easter, or not, the week after Easter, I was exhausted. Jesse and I were out super late the night before.
Right.
And Sophie came to church, sat with the adults. And as soon as worship got done, I sat down and pretty much fell asleep immediately. And I could feel myself nodding off, and I woke up, and Sophie was kind of giving me the elbow. She's like, Dad, you slept through the whole thing. There's only 2 minutes left. And I was like, oh my gosh. I was super embarrassed. I turned and looked at the clock, and then I looked back at her, and she was just like laughing hysterically because it was only 11:42. So there's still 18 minutes of serving to go. And she's like, gotcha. And I was like, oh man, she really did get me. Because I was like out. I was out hard enough, right? It could have been 30 minutes of sleep. It turned out it was only 12, but it was way long.
Yeah.
By the time worship got over, but it was really funny though. I was like, oh
that's
man.
so good.
Also, I was super disappointed. I'm like, 18 more minutes. Come on. Do you think there's like a fear amongst Christians that when they have too much fun or they make jokes or they fall asleep in church that they're being irreverent?
Yes. It's somehow it's wrong.
Well, I think there's times I think it's kind of easy to like go over the line.
Yes.
And become irreverent or maybe even blasphemous, like unintentionally.
I would agree.
And so I think that's almost like a big fear, right? It's like, okay, we don't want to accidentally, not take this seriously, so we'll just take it real seriously.
But it's also almost like this borderline hierarchy where it's the pastors should be the most Christ-like, and therefore they are the most stringent in following all these sets of rules.
Super disciplined.
Super disciplined. Yeah. So therefore you are trying to meet up to their level.
Right.
And if you aren't there, then they can call you out, and it's almost like a principal's office of following the rules. When in reality, I think that's part of the whole downfall of, obviously, I think it shatters so many people's worlds when they hear of pastors who are not nearly the Christians that they think they are. Like, obviously, we've all heard of the horrible things of people being molested and those sorts of things, and obviously that's
I don't think
way
that's what
wrong
you're
in
referring to, though.
Different realm.
Mm-hmm.
But even
going to the bar,
right? To me, I remember hearing of pastors I think Rob Bell again was one of the first ones where it's like, oh, he went and drank a beer or something like that. And it's like, oh, you can be like a quote unquote normal person.
Right.
And still be a pastor. Like that makes you more relatable to me, in my opinion. And there's a stronger desire for me as opposed to simply somebody who follows the rule that I can't feel like I necessarily totally associate.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. No fun whatsoever.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of it's like a fine line, right? Because
It is. Totally.
Doesn't Christ talk about don't cast your pearls amongst pigs?
Mm-hmm.
And so you're like, okay, I don't want to be down in the dumps with people. And yet he also eats dinner with sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes and invites them into his home. And, you know, he didn't have a home, but in the parable, right?
Yeah.
Encourages you to do that.
He didn't have a home?
Well, I mean, I would say
He was
more
like
nomadic.
an itinerant preacher.
Nomadic.
Yeah.
I mean, he had a home, in the first 30 years, but.
Do you think? That's interesting. I guess I never really thought
he was
that.
homeless.
Jesus is homeless.
Was he homeless?
Unemployed, homeless bum.
Yeah.
Long-haired, huge
Hippie.
Totally.
Yeah,
I've met so many homeless people just like that.
And just about reading this, like the gospel and stuff like that, I think that they would be homeless too. Every place that he went, he was staying with someone else too.
Yeah, right.
Like, it was always he's inviting himself into somebody's home or something like that. Or
That's
somebody's
interesting. I
inviting
never really
him
thought
into
about
somebody's
that.
homes. I think, yeah, I would probably agree with that he was.
I mean, he definitely had a home as a growing up.
Right.
You're saying once he started.
Yeah, once he started his ministry.
He started his ministry.
Let's say his first 30 years, he lived with his parents or whatever. Maybe he got his own place, a little 2-bedroom studio. No such thing.
Like out at the river.
I don't think there's any such thing as a 2-bedroom studio, but I'm not an apartment guy.
He's got 2 beds on opposite ends of the room.
Yeah. 2 Murphy beds that just fold into each other.
So, I mean, what were some of the things that, I don't know, that you thought were sinful that were actually just fun?
One of the
Getting wasted.
Yeah.
No, I think that actually was.
Crack cocaine.
one of the ones to me has always been dirty jokes.
Right.
And you guys know, like I really enjoy making a dirty
good
joke.
Filthy joke.
Filthy jokes, one of sexually laced jokes.
Right.
I find it hilarious to me. And I've never felt like, I always felt like I couldn't say those at like Christian camp or something like that. And somebody, I think it was in high school maybe, was like, that falls under adultery based upon you having dirty talk and language. And
Right.
to me, it's like, really? Like, I don't know. I don't really think so. I never felt that way. And I was like, this feels like too strict. This feels too much of abiding by the law. Where it's like, I can make a joke and I think it's hilarious and I crack up and it brings joy and happiness to my life. And
Yeah.
and my wife like thinks they're hilarious. Not all of them.
Right, yeah.
20% of them she thinks they're funny, right? So
Frankly,
yeah,
that
on a
seems
good
high.
day, 10% of them.
Right, yeah.
One time she thought it was funny, and
That sounds like when I do puns.
exactly.
Out of every 10.
But I remember that one time,
yeah.
and
I just live off that one time.
and so it was like, oh, it was part of like our connection. So honestly, I felt like after we got married that like it almost was like a little bit more acceptable for me to make some of those jokes because, oh, now you're a married man and it's less sexual or something like that. But that's one that's always stuck out to me.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, there's been that too. I think substance use is a big one for me. Like, I always felt like anybody that smoked a cigar for
Did you pull out a banana purposely when I'm talking about making sexual jokes?
he already bit the tip on it,
Just the tip.
which is
Name your sex food.
he bit the tip off. So when I was growing up, it was sort of invested in the straight edge scene. So the idea that like
I can't really see that.
you had to abstain from alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs. Some people didn't.
Also, please sign this contract that says you will.
Right.
High school, remember?
Yeah. And it was like another subculture kind of thing, but it was almost like a rule following I'm more righteous than you kind of thing. Which I think we all get stuck in lots of various ways, but that was just one way. So like, even like my dad was a smoker, and I thought, oh man, that must be sinful what he's doing there. He must have to like ask for forgiveness for this thing because he's treating his body so poorly or whatever. Or just the fact that he's lighting something up and you had to be a certain age to do it makes it sinful kind of thing. So, but I think it's more complicated
okay,
than
so,
that.
right. So I was always told like even speeding, was like a sin because you're not obeying the laws of the land.
Agreed. Yeah.
And part of me is like, yeah, okay, I get it. But so like talking about smoking, right? So it's not sinful, or it is sinful until you turn 18.
Right.
So like when you're 17, 364 days, that's a sin. But after midnight, then it's no longer a sin.
Yeah, see, I've always felt like sin is more of a morality, like a question of morality and not legality.
That's a great way to put it.
And I know that in some, like, I think Christ says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's.
Right.
Kind of implying, yeah, about taxes and tithing in that context, but also sort of like implying to me, respect the laws of your, where you're living or of your time potentially.
Yeah.
I think you could interpret it that way. But I never really felt like that. I never felt like, oh, just because the government tells me I can't,
right,
doesn't mean it's sinful that I do.
Right. Which is
if it's certain laws, like you said, speeding, like I'm glad that you guys built these roads and they're only really designed to go 55. Fine. But if I can do 65 and I'm not endangering anybody,
endangering part of
I don't really feel any kind of moral guilt there. Yeah, if you tell me I'm not allowed to kill anybody, yeah, I would agree with that. I also think breaking that law is sinful, right?
Right.
I'd be curious, like back in, like in the Old Testament times, or like really even around Christ's time and stuff like that, when it was the Roman Empire, but then the Jews had their own laws. Did they consider breaking a Roman law that wasn't a Jewish law?
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's a good point.
Or
yeah, I don't think so. So because there was lots of them that were highly religious that were also very anti-Roman.
Right.
Yeah. And
so
like
they
didn't think of it like that.
I don't know. It's just kind of, I was just thinking about that. I'm like, man, I don't know what. I think I agree. I think it was more like a more morality thing than it is like focusing on the law of the land. It's more about you're trying to line up and live like Christ.
Yeah. And like you go to countries in Europe, prostitution's legal. Obviously here it's not.
Right.
So like that doesn't change. I think engaging with a prostitute is sinful, whether it's here or whether you're in Europe. So that's where like the local government doesn't really affect how I feel about different actions or sins.
Yeah. If I'm going 76 on I-75, I don't think I'm really sinning there.
Yeah, right. Right.
Yeah, and I actually thought that for a while too. Or that like I'm listening, like let's say I'm listening to a band that's not a Christian band. Like, oh, this must be sinful because they're not Christians. And so, or I'm reading a book that was not written by a Christian author. Oh, this must be sinful.
Yeah, I never felt like that.
Looking at a piece of art that was not created by a Christian artist, like that's.
Are you saying you used to feel that way, or did, or
I
still
did.
do? Or?
Yeah, and even sometimes still sort of flare up like that kind of thing here and there. But the other way and I've thought about it quite a bit in my own life. The other way to look at it is to see the action of God within those things. And that's one other way to look at it, is to say God expresses himself through all these different types of media, sometimes even like unknown to the artists themselves. Mm-hmm. He expresses his love or his beauty or what have you, and so that there is joy in that. I mean, are there things that are go too far with that? That yes,
too far.
Okay, cute. One of my questions, I think, for that argument of God can act within any type of thing, or that he can inspire you in all sorts of different ways through different media, is how far is too far with those things. So, can somebody justify watching pornography? Oh, look, this is God made our bodies.
Right.
And look, it's a beautiful act. And they're pretending like they're married on the screen. So,
yeah, I think you're making an overall bigger point, though, right?
yeah, like what's the line that draws that is
Right.
the
And
line,
it's
or is it just
easier-
a feeling?
Yeah, it's easier to it's less messy and less gray to simply say, hey, you don't drink, you don't do any sort of drugs, you don't do this, you don't do that.
You don't watch R-rated movies, you don't,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
And there is some value in it. Like, I mean, because a lot of people can't handle, it's almost like, oh, once you cross this bridge, we're trying to protect you from ever going over across that bridge because once you go there, you won't be able to handle yourself and you won't be able to come back.
Yeah. And there's a lot of truth to that.
There is.
Yeah.
Particularly with substances.
For
Not
sure.
so much cigarettes, but alcohol
Right.
and weed and
Marijuana.
any of these things that are like altering your state of consciousness.
Right.
You absolutely are impaired in your decision making and your judgment.
Absolutely.
And that typically goes hand in hand with putting yourself in situations that are absolutely sinful.
Right.
Or a much higher likelihood of being sinful.
Yeah.
And so it's a lot easier just to abstain or to not put yourself in that situation to begin with.
I think that's when I was thinking about substances, just growing up into my adulthood, and looking at what the Bible really says about them. In specific situations for specific people, it does tell them to abstain completely, like in the Old Testament, for example, like the Nazirite vow.
Mm-hmm.
And people have used that to say, well, all Christians should hold themselves to this example also, which I disagree with. But it seems to be a clear indication throughout the entire Bible that drunkenness is a bad thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think to me, that's the idea of going too far with it.
Yeah.
Like what you're saying, well, like it's affecting your decisions in such a capacity that you're making dangerous decisions. Yeah. You're doing risky things that you wouldn't, endangering yourself and others. Like drinking and driving is to me a clear example of something that would be sinful. Drinking and driving.
So I think the bigger question within that then is like, is it going back to what you're saying, Will, is the general rule don't drink, for example, don't drink. But if you feel like you are mature enough in your faith and able to handle it, you can drink some, just make sure that you are still able to be responsible within that. Right.
So specifically drinking?
Yeah, I mean, you can take anything.
So bring it up as that example. I mean, I'm by far the most experienced drinker here, right?
Definitely.
And I can 100% attest to the fact that when you drink, it's difficult to know where your state of consciousness is.
Right.
And it's very difficult to have the same amount of self-control you would when you're sober.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so you're much more likely to do stupid things, sinful things when you're under the influence of alcohol. 100%.
Sure.
But there's also nothing wrong with drinking alcohol. Jesus drinks wine, right? I mean, it's right in the Bible. There's clearly drinking alcohol is fine. And at no point does it say, hey, you shouldn't drink wine or you shouldn't drink any alcohol. It says you shouldn't be drunk. And there's a definitely like a clear tipping point when you have drank alcohol, one or two drinks.
Yeah.
And to when you cross that line into you're now drunk.
Is it?
And
because that seems different than what you just said. You said the consciousness it's hard to gauge that.
When you're drinking, it's very hard to gauge that.
Okay.
Because you can have 2 beers. No, I'm fine.
Yeah.
But like, well, why are you talking so loud?
Right. Yeah.
It's like, I'm fine. I've had 2.
Right.
And everyone's like, well, you're kind of argumentative. You're kind of like, you're talking about staying out all night. Like clearly like 2 drinks ago, this wasn't in your idea.
Correct. Yeah.
But now it is. And what I meant was like your level, it's very hard to be self-aware while you're drinking of what your state of consciousness is.
Okay.
The most common thing you ever see is drunk people overestimate their abilities.
Right. Yeah.
I can drive home. Oh, I'm going to beat that guy up. I'm going to beat that guy's ass, right? Or whatever. And you're like, dude, you beat him up? You can barely stand up.
exactly.
But here you are. You're sure that you can win in a fight right now, and you can't see, and you can't walk. Okay.
Yeah.
And if you tell a drunk person, hey, you shouldn't do that, you're drunk. What do they tell you?
Yeah.
I'm not drunk. Don't tell me how drunk I am. I'm not drunk.
Exactly.
Right. So clearly they are now past that point where they have any kind of like self-control or self-awareness, or are even like in tune with what their actual state of consciousness is.
Right.
And that's what I'm saying. When you're in those states, and it doesn't take long, right? It depends on what you're eating and what you're drinking,
all
the factors, how tired you are, how stressed you are, all that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it can be 1 or 2 drinks and you can feel drunk. Mm-hmm. And it can be 10 drinks and you don't feel anything, even though you are.
So then within that, is it like, is not drinking supposed to be like keeping you, how do I phrase it? Like, I feel like you can mature in those types of situations where you can go and have a drink and be fine.
A lot of people do that.
Yeah.
And a lot of Christians do that.
But there's this perception that is sinful.
Right.
And I don't agree with
specific denominations for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think what is sinful is your lack of self-control and putting yourself into that situation. But you can also, again, within that, mature. And it feels like so many times we say, just don't even drink because you don't want to get drunk and then make a poor decision. But conversely, you could also say, be responsible when you drink. If you make a mistake and get drunk, you need to learn from that.
Absolutely.
And mature into making a better decision.
Yeah.
Right.
And you know what I mean?
Yeah. And different personalities are have different levels of tolerance, I would say. And I don't mean physical tolerance, like how much they can drink. I mean, their personalities are, wow, I've had 2, I better slow down.
Right.
I don't want to end up drunk. And other people are, give me a break. I've only had 2.
Right.
And they're both equally impaired. And they're both on very different trajectories for their evening. Okay. The one guy is going to get 10 beers in and swear he's still fine.
Yeah.
And he can drive and he can do this and his wife won't care if he does that. Right. And the other guy is like, yeah, I'm 2 beers in. Now 3 hours later, I'm a 3rd beer in for the day, but I'm still completely under control. I'm not legally over the limit. I'm not in the point where my decision making is impaired. They're both drinking. They're both having fun.
Yeah.
But one guy is clearly sinful and the other isn't, in my opinion. But
what is the sinful portion?
When you cross that line into drunkenness, that's where I would say.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the law would define that as when your blood alcohol content exceeds 0.08.
Sure.
And realistically, that's probably a pretty good, like there's probably quite a bit of science behind that says, yeah, that's where the average person, but there's other people who are 0.04 and they're tipsy and they're out grinding on a dance floor and they're like, whoa, having the time of my life. And there's other people who can be 0.3 and still drive a car. Right. And that, that goes back to your physical tolerance and how like often you get drunk and everything. But
exactly.
So it's not necessarily the number, but at some point you become drunk.
Yeah. I think and
that's where it becomes sin.
Yeah. 2 parts I agree with you, Will. I think there's two answers for you, Kyle, for kind of what you're thinking about with when does it become sinful and why is it seen so sinful and why does the church have the approach of just don't do it because you're going to get caught in it or whatever. One is that it's such a dangerous activity like drinking and driving, and we can all have examples of people we know or maybe have heard about that have gotten into accidents from drinking and driving and or fatal accidents, that they've been killed. And so the stakes are so high with drinking. And that's the message is always coming to, and of course that I think transfers over to other ones, but then also from a Christian approach too, it's like, there was always a sense of like, wherever you go, people are watching you and you are supposed to be Jesus to these people. So are you going to be a drunk person and not like show who, like it seems like you don't even care about the gospel. You don't even care about what God did for you because you're enjoying yourself or whatever. And I think that talks to what Piper was trying to say in this is that like, people do think that like if you're not having any fun, then you must be a more devout Christian because you're not enjoying something, because you know that enjoying something is an immature thing. And so you must not be a mature Christian if you're enjoying something, whether that's alcohol.
You're saying that that's what society thinks?
I think that's what,
or a lot of Christian people think.
Like a top-down sort of like Christian idea thinks that if you're not out there like being as somber as possible, then you probably are not a very mature Christian, because people who are mature don't have fun.
Yeah, I think that's
is the opposite of fun.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I think that's a pretty antiquated look at it.
Right.
I think most Christians don't.
Isn't that we kind of been raised in that? I felt like I was raised in that antiquated.
To some extent,
yeah.
To some extent, yeah.
Maybe now there's a difference because of our generation that are becoming parents, and
yeah, I think yes. I don't think everybody feels that way, though.
Okay,
that was my point. I think there are a lot of people who think that, but I don't think it's everybody. I don't think it's all Christians think that you have to be somber and you have to be unfun and just be sitting in the corner of the bar waiting to go home. Right. And someone's like, "What's wrong, man? Are you having a bad day?" "No, I'm having a fine day, but I'm just trying to remember what Christ did for me." Like, I mean, how weird would that be, right? Like, don't be the Christian martyr. Nobody wants that.
Yeah.
You're not witnessing positively to anybody in that situation. I think a positive witness, in my opinion, is like, go be with your friends, go to the bar, have fun, go to the wedding, dance on the floor, like, and do it without being drunk. Do it without using the F word like a comma.
Yeah.
Just go out and have a good time and have like your actions reflect your awareness of what Christ did for you.
Yeah.
And when somebody asks like, "Oh, you don't drink anymore?" or "How come you don't drink, Kyle?" I just never really wanted to. I felt like it was sinful to get drunk and I didn't want to go down that route. I knew my personality, and and I think that shows like a lot of self-awareness and reflection on and like a commitment to abstaining from sin, really, is what we're talking about here. It's not abstaining from alcohol or anything. It's just, I don't want to be sinful, and my odds of being sinful are a lot higher when I'm under the influence of alcohol.
For sure.
And that's for me, for sure.
Yeah.
All of the dumbest things I've done in my life are when I'm wasted.
So I think of it a lot of times from like a teaching perspective, because that's just what my brain goes. I think
such a teacher.
Hey, for real, but it's like almost like we teach kids and adults to an extent, or it's like, we don't think we can trust you. We think you should just completely stay away, instead of like teaching what you're just saying, Will, of like, hey, it's okay for you to be in there and doing those things, but you have to have the self-awareness and the maturity to be above it, essentially, right?
Yeah.
But it's almost like, we don't think you're going to be able to be above it, therefore you shouldn't even be in it.
Agreed.
And it's way worse for you to screw up a time or a few times than to ever even put yourself in that situation. And I don't know, I'm not sure I fully agree with that. I think we have to make mistakes. You come to Christ for forgiveness and learn and grow and mature within that. And being a dad now, I mean, like, it makes you think about all those things as our kids slowly get closer and closer to that age.
Think
how are you going to handle that? Like, because I mean, I'm sure we can all give countless examples of like, hey, don't you dare go out and do that. And then it actually made that child or that person more rebellious. Like, you're going to tell me to not do it? No, I'm definitely going to do it.
Right.
More.
100%. But I think as parents and as teachers, you want them to avoid harm, and you want them to not have to endure the pain that comes with those lessons.
Right.
It's easier if you can just take my word for it.
Yeah.
And not have to go through a real traumatic experience. Or
but do people really learn like that?
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly my point.
Like, just when you were saying that, like, and I've thought about this too. Just okay, so we're in a broken world, we're in a sinful world. Maybe a prerequisite of actually learning a deep lesson is the pain of a mistake,
right?
Like a personal mistake.
So so I agree with you to some extent, right? But let's make it a little more personal. I'll give you an example. Like, we all have daughters. Joey, you don't have kids yet, but the rest of us all have daughters. Do you want her to go out and get wasted at a college party and get molested or raped, and then be like, well, now she learned a lesson not to overdrink? Like, wouldn't you much rather just her not overdrink to begin with, so that horrible traumatic thing doesn't happen to her?
Agreed, but I'm saying within that,
sure.
You know what I'm saying? So that's what I think. That's what you're getting to. Is like, well, I don't want you to learn not to drink and drive because you killed one of your friends. Like you're saying, the stakes are so high. Like, I don't want you to get in a car accident and drive in and have a friend killed, and then you're like, see, now you learn your lesson.
Agreed,
You would much rather than just learn the lesson. Like, take my word for it. You can't drink and drive.
Perception of like telling them don't do this.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Doesn't always work, right? You know what I mean?
I would say half the time. I would say half the time, and maybe more. It encourages the other way, right?
Exactly.
So,
and then they hide it from you and say like,
it's a really hard
balance because because my parents always said don't ever do this.
I wouldn't
as opposed
teach.
to if you say like, hey, be careful in these situations because this happens to girls, this happens to guys. Like,
yeah, right.
When they get so drunk, they can get taken advantage of. You need to have that on your radar if you're in that type of situation.
Agreed.
You know what I mean? Like,
I wouldn't encourage my kids to be teetotalers when it comes to alcohol specifically.
Yeah,
but I would encourage them to be, I guess. I wouldn't like dictate that they do or I guess my hope would be that like you can have a healthy fear of alcohol.
right.
Because I think that's lost. Like, you go to a college campus and it's just all fun and games and there's nothing bad that happens when you're on. Like, everyone drinks. It's just what we do. It's so fun. Party this weekend. And it's so like, it's such a pervasive thought because like the reality is there's a lot of horrible things that happen when people are drinking, and a lot of lives are ruined because of mistakes when people are drinking. And if I can help my kids understand that before they're in the moment where they're being asked to overdrink, that would be a much more ideal.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I think it's just like, and granted, I'm the one that doesn't have kids in this situation. You have to like being willing to like have an open conversation and don't just call it out and say, oh, don't do that just because it's right or something like that. Like I think we were talking about earlier, like that's like you walk into a room and there's a big red button on the wall that says, don't push this red button.
Right.
The first thing I'm going to want to do when I walk in that room is push that red button.
Heck yeah.
Like if someone doesn't explain to me why I shouldn't be pushing it, something like that. Now, if somebody walks up to me and says like, hey, that red button's going to kind of blow up this whole room while you're in it.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not going to push the red button. You know?
Right.
But
Yeah, there's that. And yeah, I think that's human nature. But I guess to my point I was thinking before is that because the world is a sinful world, like maybe when things started out in paradise and we weren't meant to live in a sinful world, we could learn all of these lessons directly from God.
Yeah.
And have a strengthened kind of mature decision-making process that was free from sin. But since this is happening, no, I don't want the people that I love to go through tragedy,
right,
in any capacity.
Right.
However, if they do, and let's face it, tragedy happens all the time. If and when they do, I want God to be able to use that as much as possible, and I want them to be open to it as much as possible.
Yeah.
So how do we prep them for that kind of thing? Because like, you can be the most sober driver out there of all time and still get hit by a drunk driver.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You can be...
For sure. Tragedies happen, right?
Yeah. You can be the safest gun, user or like the safest hunter and then get hit by a stray bullet or something. So
yeah,
like there's always going to be some kind of tragedy in this world. So how do we, especially, well, I think it's really, it hits you in a soft spot when you think about your kids, because you really want, you've seen them all throughout their life, and your natural inclination is to protect them from everything. And isn't that how God views us too? that he wants to protect us from everything, but he also wants us to grow and mature. Like there's that sentiment where, some people who have kids, they say, I wish my kids could just stay little forever because they're so cute and they're so innocent and da-da-da. Like, that's not how God views us. And I've never really thought about that for my kids. I've really tried to just enjoy them at every age.
Yeah.
But like, there is that sentiment that like, let's keep you in a box sort of thing, and you'll never get bigger. And I think that God does want us to grow, but it was like what you were saying, Kyle, like, here's the dangers of growing up, and here's the things that you can do to help prevent some of these dangers, or and then hope that they have a good group of friends that will help them as well.
I think a lot of it too is age-wise, like exposing a child or a kid to something that they're not ready to be exposed to mature to. I think there are like different levels as you get older of what you're ready to hear and see and
100%
and understand.
For sure.
Like, when I was teaching preschool, I had to call CPS because one of my 5-year-olds described her grandma showing her porn.
Right.
Like in detail. And it's like, that's going to mess her up for
long time,
forever.
Yeah.
Not to say like that porn is acceptable at a certain age, but like at some age, having the sex talk in those situations, you have to have those, right? It's not like some of that has to come to fruition. And I think you can take it to extremes on different tragedies, but I'm also okay with my kids failing and stumbling, because they have to learn within that and getting knocked down. And it's about how you respond and how you respond to God, how you respond personally. So I don't know. There's a thin line there.
Definitely.
There's a whole bunch of gray. It's like there's two different lines, right? Where you get drunk, to go back to that, or you can never drink. But the reality is 98% of that is the gray area right in between there.
Exactly.
Agreed.
Yeah. And I guess something my kids, I hope they can learn lessons without like some kind of unbelievable tragedy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. Sure. Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Like I hope that they can, I don't know, it seems so selfish, but like, okay, if they have somebody that they know and it happened to, I mean, like, if
they could just have one or two bad friends, that
exactly.
would be great.
Yeah.
Don't be like that.
We need to sacrifice like one or two of their friends just to show them. That'll be fine. But
we're gonna want to cut that one.
Right.
No, you're right.
It kind of goes back to the original sin though, right? Where it's like God tells Adam and Eve not
to do something.
Yeah, he doesn't cut the tree down for him though.
He leaves it there.
Right. He leaves there. He gives them the free will,
and then there's a curiosity.
Yep.
He also
agreed. I was just thinking that a minute ago, and like, there's
Satan is still there, tempting.
Yeah. And I think that's like the model that we should use as parents is to explain to them the limits, and it's our responsibility to help them understand the consequences of their choices, but not to make the choices for them.
Right.
That's what I was saying. I wouldn't tell my kids you're absolutely never allowed to drink. That's you're not a Christian. I wouldn't tell them that at all. I don't feel that way. But I would try to expose them to the consequences of over drinking and what that looks like, and hopefully they're able to make a smart decision that says, yeah, this is a net negative in my life, and I'm gonna do my best to not be like my dad.
Right. Yeah. That negative example. Sometimes negative examples work better than positive examples.
For sure.
Usually I would say.
I was just thinking, what if you did a Garden of Eden thing at your house where you took like a Christmas tree and put a bunch of bad things on it and said, no, you guys can't go do this. Right. Yeah. And see how long you're going to last. They actually did it.
And then if they eat it,
that would be fast.
Then if they eat it, condemn them to a lifetime of generational curse.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
They condemn them all to hell for their rest of eternity.
Pain during childbirth and all sorts of things.
And one of us comes like dressed in black and just talks. And from the background, Did your dad really say don't eat the donut?
Gabby is so annoyed because I've read her that story so many times, and she's like, so what is a serpent? And I'm like, a serpent is a snake. She's like, but they're not a snake yet though, because the serpent tempts them, but the serpent isn't a serpent until after they get in trouble. And then he gets condemned to a lifetime of crawling in the dust on his belly. And I'm like, I know what you're saying, but I'm like, okay, a serpent, it's like a symbolism. She's like, that doesn't make sense. And I'm like, okay, Gabby, I know it doesn't can you just please? Why do they say serpent? Oh,
That's really good.
But hold on, Gabby. Let me read it to you in Hebrew.
yeah.
This word isn't so good. But if that was literal, then the idea is that like a serpent had some kind of vertebrae to be able to stand up.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like
Why?
had some way, because
Back in the day, you mean?
you're cursed to go on your belly for that long.
Yeah. I always think of the serpent as almost like a spirit.
Think so?
Is the way I always thought of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is the word in Hebrew?
Nachash.
Does it mean serpent?
Yes. It's the same word that they use for
Snake.
crawling reptiles kinds of things without legs. So there's a plethora of different the Hebrew animal, like what do they call them? Like the different ways that they describe animals, like in
The flora and fauna.
yes. Or like the animal
That would be the
genomes and
fauna.
all the different like specific things that we use, like the scientific names for things. It's much more general.
Yeah.
Right.
Like when they say like, oh, the creepy crawly things.
Yeah.
That could mean a plethora of different ways. That could be bugs. That could be lizards.
Snake.
You know what I mean? That could be like
The neighbor
worms.
next door.
Right. Yeah. It could. Yeah. Which is always interesting. And they talk about the. I said this, I think, on one of our last meetings, where I said something about the
Again, repeat.
like the giant sea serpents that are in the Book of Job. That could be just alligators, or it might be like the Loch Ness monsters. I mean, so like there's
Probably the Loch Ness.
it's probably Nessie.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Anything more about this book? There
Any
was
other
so-
good questions in there?
There's some really good ones, but they're very in depth about the specific chapters. And I don't know if we've been mostly just talking about the idea of Christian humanism.
Okay, quick confession. It took me about 4 chapters in to realize that he was saying hedonism. I kept thinking he was talking about heathenism, like being a heathen. And honestly, it was like the hardest thing for me. It was like I'm 4 chapters in. I'm like, Christian heathenism is such an oxymoron. Like,
right.
like you're a Christian, but you love to be horrible. I was like, I don't understand what he's talking about. And then I finally I Googled it, and it was hedonism spelled with a D. And I was like, oh, hedonism, like, oh, somebody who likes to pursue pleasure.
Right.
Yeah. And I was like, oh, that's a humongous difference in the meaning of this entire book.
Heathenism, like super liberal denomination.
Yeah, Christian heathen. He's a Christian heathen. And I was like, man, and he's like, that's why I devoted my whole life to being a Christian heathen. I'm like, boy, that sounds like me. Basically,
wow,
just a horrible Christian. Like, oh, that's definitely really
Mad Christian.
Yeah, I literally was like, I don't get this book.
We talked about some of these ones before, like the illustration of buying your wife flowers and
what a waste of money that is.
Exactly. I mean, they're just gonna die anyway.
Right.
Like you're just gonna wilt and
like your affection.
Ashley never let me buy her flowers. She had that very same logical approach to it. Of
like you're just gonna die anyway.
You know, every woman says that, right?
I literally didn't buy her flowers for the first 15 years that we were together.
Yeah.
Sometimes I get them out, and she's just like, "Well, thanks. These are fine."
It doesn't really make that big of an impact.
Not to you.
I believe her when she says that, because
or is she trying to make you try her?
Bingo.
No, she would rather have something more practical, like, oh, you buy me chocolate? Oh, I can consume this, and this brings me more joy and pleasure than a flower does.
Yeah, that's.
But I think that's just
sure.
Subjective, like for
Personality wise.
The one of the chapters about.
Let me guess, you don't get her birthday presents or Christmas presents.
we don't.
No, just
You guys
We
really don't?
We don't. We don't.
We kind of got out of that too.
we don't
Honestly,
do Christmas
We
presents.
did,
for
we did
used
for
to-
a little while until I found out like my wife's love language
is gifts.
is gifts.
Oh,
see,
okay.
And
our-
she would say that to be like, okay, I don't want to like
Let you off the
say-
hook.
Yeah. She would just say like, whatever. And then when I did try, it made a very big impact.
So when we were younger, we would like shower each other with lavish gifts.
Yeah.
And then we kind of got out of that because I was like, I think we kind of grew up to the point where we would just buy what we wanted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. It was like, well, if I really want something that bad, I'll just buy it.
Yeah.
It's like a
And-
joint bank account for us.
Yeah, and it was
No
sort of
longer-
ruins that.
It's
Yeah.
like, oh, and now that Ashley's the only working,
You have to get a loan from her.
It's like, oh, I'm
Good luck
taking
paying
the
me
money-
back on your $0 a year salary, babe.
benefits.
It's like when you give your kids $10 and say, go buy me a birthday present.
Yeah,
Yeah,
But
right,
That's
right.
what's happening with
Yeah.
you and Ashley.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I guess you could buy something for me for my money.
So was Kyle the child in that example?
Kyle's the child, yes.
Oh.
So he's not CEO of his household.
no, yeah, we already
Yeah.
addressed this.
That was one of those little. I love that. One of the things he says about love is not. There's a common motto that he tries to address. Love is not what you feel, but what you do.
Yeah,
And
I didn't love his take on that.
he talked
But did you
about
do that?
Mm, I didn't love it.
Hey, but you're only feeling that you didn't love it.
Right, and then I do not like it at all.
You need to have cause. It's
Because I hate him, David. I have cause.
So is it more about what you do, or is it more about what you feel, or is there something in the middle? What are you
I
guys?
think there's times where you have to do both. I don't always feel like I love my wife, but when I go and do something that I would do if I really loved
When I
her,
go and do
it makes
her,
me
I-
feel.
Makes you feel.
Reminds me like, oh, I really
I
do
do
love
love
her.
her. Yeah.
So I think there's
There's times where you don't
where
feel
both.
like you love your wife.
Like when you're mad at her or something. You know what I mean? I'm not that I don't love her, but like
Maybe I don't like her right
so
now.
annoyed with her right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
Oh, I
I
can't
could-
stand this about her personality, or I hate when she does this. And it's like, yeah,
More
but
examples. Keep going.
yeah,
More specific.
she's so good in bed. It's so annoying.
Yeah.
It's just so annoying how good she is in bed. Ugh. 3 times a day. Want to do sex again? So annoying.
Oh my God. Like I'm tapped out. I'm all dry.
Firing blanks over there.
I'm faking it.
Faking
I
it.
don't think any guy
A
is
lot harder for a guy to fake it.
right. Exactly. He's faking it.
Still rock hard.
He is. Yeah.
You're gonna want to bookmark that. Yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah, but I think that the liking sense is also. He said something about how love. I really like this chapter on love. He said that love, what you're doing for others, is like the over pouring. Is that what he said, Joey? The pouring over of joy that God gives to you.
Yeah.
Like it just naturally comes out.
Yep.
How you interact with.
Like when you're like, I always think like when they're you're so imagine yourself as a cock, right? If you're feeling like you're constantly or God is constantly pouring into you, everything that's pouring out over top of that cup is going to spill out on others, and that's kind of how
And that's the love.
exactly, and that's the love. Like God's love is pouring onto you. You can't handle all of it, so you're sharing it with others. It's pouring out past your own capacities.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I think that's good illustration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So which is more important, what you do or what you feel when it comes to love?
Yeah, I view the doing portion as
I always feel like that's more important.
the over. Well, I guess to go back to what you're saying, kind of like I feel like you love. When you feel like you love somebody, you naturally do
That's what I was thinking.
things to show that.
Right.
I don't think it's the other way around.
I think it's real unfair when you don't do anything. And they're like, I don't feel loved. And you're like, well, I love you. So, and you're always, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But there's, I think guys do that a lot though,
Yeah.
where it's like, I love you. Like we don't need to keep talking about this,
Yeah.
you know? And you're like, and you truly feel deep down like you really, really love your wife.
Yeah.
And she's like, well, you don't make me feel love. And you're like, well, I do love you. So
agree to
I don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
I'd be like, Josh,
I'll do.
Right. Yes.
I'll do.
I'm not
you.
going to do
If you want me to
stupid
do
romance.
you, I can do that.
Now I've grown in that area quite a bit.
Yeah. In 2013, my wife and I bought this property in the other house. And I remember really, really praying.
Was this part of it already?
This property was, yeah. And I remember praying like a really earnest prayer at the time, like, Lord, just help me get the financing for this house. Because at the time it was a lot of money and I didn't make that much money and all. Like, Lord, please just help this financing go through, help the inspection, just put your hand of guidance on this. I really feel like this can be like a great place for fellowship and like,
Yeah.
I will. And I remember like almost bargaining with God, like,
Yeah.
please just let me get this house so that I can like use this as a tool to minister to people and stuff. And I remember that like whatever it was 12 years ago. And I just had that thought today, like that you guys were all coming over and I was like cleaning up the garage a little bit. And I'm like, what an awesome answer to prayer.
Yeah.
And what it's so cool to look back a decade later and see like the desires of my heart kind of coming to fruition and being like, hey, able to actually like utilize this property and this like ground as like a hallowed ground and a place that, people can come and we can grow our faith and just do all that. And that's just really off topic, but it was really, it was just kind of like a cool moment. I just kind of remembered that today when I was thinking about it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I think we can actually bring that back on topic too.
I was just thinking
because
is it during the money chapter?
Yeah.
Does he talk about owning 2 houses?
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Where were you going?
I was going a little bit with that, but also kind of like
Totally different book.
No, like
Trump's book, is that?
Yeah, no, I think so. But yeah, in the money chapter though, he also says like, it's like the purpose of like, what is the money is the
Root of all evil.
No, it's what's his quote for the money chapter? No, it is.
I can't.
It's money is the something of a Christian key.
More money, more problems.
Oh, it's what currency? He says
Currency.
money. Yeah, the
money
currency.
is the currency of Christian hedonism. His essentially like his whole take on the whole chapter is essentially like,
yes,
if you're blessed with wealth, your responsibility with wealth is to still further the kingdom, to use that wealth to further the kingdom, not to use it to seek out
not to just
personal gain. Exactly.
Right, yeah.
And so like that's when you're talking about that, like you're right. I feel like that, and that could even be like, and I don't want to go with the whole prosperity gospel thing or anything like that, but like your prayer of that is like your prayer was, I can see this being a place where people come and do gather and to do have that
and to glorify you.
Exactly. Glorify your name through these conversations, through this hosting of these people over here. And like that could even be like and just trying to bring full circle back into the book, it's like I can see that in that.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
We went through that a ton too when I when we were building our house, I had that thought so many times where it's like, dude, is this too much? Like,
right.
It felt like
really an indoor gym.
Yeah. Like realistically, I mean, there were so many times I had that thought.
Modest.
But it was like, one, I felt I got a ton of joy and happiness out of being able to create and going back to where he says providing for my family and for our future of our family. And we went through the same thing where it's like we love to host and we wanted it to be a place where people could come together and have a meal. And that's what hosting community group to us there for so long was of fulfillment of that.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, and little did we know, like 40 years later, I'd be at home homeschooling then, and
right. Another,
and this has happened right before COVID. We're finished out the basement and those sorts of things, and it's like
it all kind of lined up.
It totally did. And there's times where we're in the basement, and I'm like, man, if we didn't have this, if we were at our old place,
it's not feasible. Really.
It wouldn't have been feasible.
Or have been very different.
Yeah,
it would have been very
different and not.
Still feasible though.
Feasible.
That's right. I do hate sometimes where, like when we
grow up and we like experience wealth, or the people a lot of times like lose perspective.
Definitely.
Like, yeah, man, if this house wasn't 5,000 square feet, I don't know how we'd get by. And you're like, yeah, there was like families who lived in 300 square feet for thousands of years, and they were happy and they were homeschooled, and they, so it's like you want to keep sight of that,
right?
Yeah,